Hi, good evening. I'm Susan Smirnoff, and I'm a co-chair of the Adult Engagement Committee here at Park Avenue Synagogue. Tonight's program is in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, and we are honored to have Jonathan Rosen speaking on his experience with this important subject. Jonathan Rosen is the author, most recently, of The Best Minds, a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions, which was named a top 10 book of the year by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, and People Magazine. It was also chosen by Barack Obama as one of his favorite books of 2023. Jonathan is also the author of the novels Eve's Apple and Joy Comes in the Morning, and two additional nonfiction books, The Talmud and the Internet, A Journey Between Worlds, and The Life of the Skies, Birding at the End of Nature. His essays and articles have appeared in the New York Times, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and numerous anthologies. He created the culture section of the Forward newspaper, which he edited for 10 years, and created and edited the Jewish Encounters book series published by Nextbook Schocken. Thank you all for being here, both at Park Avenue Synagogue and online, for joining us for this important conversation. I now turn it over to Rabbi Lori Kaufman, our moderator of tonight's discussion.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that wonderful introduction and biography, and for all the work you have done and do with us as one of the co-chairs of our Adult Engagement Committee. We're so lucky to have you as such an engaged congregant. And welcome, everyone. So good to see you all here in person. Welcome to everybody who's joining us online. We're delighted to have you all. And welcome, Jonathan. It's wonderful to have you here. I know that your family has a little bit of history here at Park Avenue. Your wife, Michal, taught here in Hebrew school. You told me your kids went to Schechter when it was here. So welcome from across the park, from the west side. And I just want to start by saying, Kol HaKavod, that it's a spectacular book. It's an incredible book. It's beautifully written. The story is just so compelling, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight. I remember several years ago I had Shabbat lunch at your home, and you told me that you were writing this book, and it was many years ago, and it's been a labor, and I want to hear about that as well. So for those who have not yet read the book, because I'm sure those who've not yet read it will certainly read it after tonight's talk, can you just give let's start with just a brief summary, and then we'll do a deeper dive.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thanks for that introduction. And it did take me a long time. My younger daughter, who went to school here as well, likes to point out she was 10 when I started writing it, and she was 20 when I published it. She almost came because she's home from college, but got a better offer because someone's going away. So do you want me to, I can describe a little bit about the book, and then maybe I'll give an overview of what it is, I suppose. It's a tragic story, but it wasn't always a tragic story, and I begin telling the story when I was 10 years old. It's the story of friendship. My best friend, Michael Laudor, is someone I met when my family moved to New Rochelle in 1973. He lived across the street from me, a very short street. There were like 7 houses, and we did everything together. We were very competitive. We went to the same camp. We both went to Yale. He graduated in 3 years. He was very brilliant. He read amazingly fast. He had a photographic memory. I'm an extremely slow reader and have a selective memory. But after he graduated, he worked for a year for a management consulting firm. The plan, we both wanted to be writers. The plan was he was going to make a ton of money in 10 years and then be a writer, which is something we both wanted to be. But after the first year already, he began suffering hallucinations, delusions. He had a psychotic break, but it took several years before that fully manifested. Sometimes there's a long, what's called a prodromal period, and he was living a kind of a life in which he was hallucinating and delusional, but concealing it at the same time. He thought people were following him home from when he would go play music. He thought eventually, when he had his crisis, he thought his parents had been replaced by replicas that looked just like his parents, but who were actually Nazis who wanted to kill him. And he began patrolling the house with a kitchen knife, and his mother called the police. And he wound up in a locked ward where he spent 8 months. The remarkable thing, though, is that he had applied to law school before he had his break, and he got into all the law schools. They were all deferred. He turned them all down except for Yale, deferred Yale, went to Yale Law School despite a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. That was the diagnosis in those days. They no longer include paranoia. These things change all the time. He was wonderfully welcomed by the school and by a set of mentors who had actually clerked for the judges who had changed the laws that had made it very difficult to hospitalize people. And they were particularly interested in giving him a home there. He was able to finish, but he couldn't do the work. He was, however, recognized as brilliant. The New York Times wrote a glowing profile of him, which brought him to the attention of Hollywood. He sold his life story to be a movie. Ron Howard was going to make the movie. Brad Pitt was cast to play him. But he stopped taking his medication, and he killed his pregnant fiancée. And then he wound up on the cover of the New York Post. So 3 years after a glowing profile in the New York Times, he was on the cover of a tabloid under a single word, psycho. And more of the story unfolds after that. And it's not only his story. I also tell Carrie's story. That's the woman he killed. And I tell my own story. The one thing I'll say, just because figuring out how to tell the story and even what the story was took a long time, because it isn't only a story. In fact, people were always telling stories. He sold the story that was going to be his life. He also sold it to be a book. But a lot of those stories weren't accurate stories. Often people retold his story for his own benefit, to kind of accommodate him or erase aspects of his illness. So it was about untelling stories as well as telling them, and it was also about finding a way to tell not only a personal story, but a story about the culture, because the culture had changed, and the changes in the culture transformed mental health care, and I wanted to know why the world that should have been there to help him was not there. And so the book is divided into houses. That's the last thing I'll say. The first house is the house in New Rochelle. The house on Maryland Road, actually, is what that first section's called, which is my house or Michael's house. It's the world of the suburbs. It's that world of childhood. And originally I was going to write the story backwards, but I discovered that I didn't want everything to be, I didn't want the tragic culmination of the story to be its starting point. I didn't want everything to be filtered through a tragic inevitability, because it was his story and other stories bound up with severe illness, and basically everyone's story happens forward, not backwards. And these were choices people made. Individual choices, the people who cared for him, but also choices people had made that changed the systems into which people were born that then had to make the choices they could make. So it seemed more generous and more in keeping with how I think about the world to write it almost like a novel. So I began it in childhood, the house on Maryland Road. The second house is the house of psychiatry, and there really was a big, beautiful house in New Rochelle where these two psychiatrists lived, and they were responsible for a lot of Michael's care. They were devoted to community psychiatry, to emptying out state hospitals and replacing it with something else. That was a disaster, but it wasn't intended to be a disaster. And Michael referred to their house as the Gatsby house. It's where he lived, actually, when he was beginning to hallucinate, but he wrote stories there. So from as far as I was concerned, it was this glamorous mansion. And so there's the house on Maryland Road. There's the house of psychiatry, a real house in a kind of figurative house. There's the house of law, that's the third section. Yale Law School really was this house of law for him. And in writing the book, his law professors were really reckoning with the world they had helped make, because law and psychiatry kind of got married in the 60s and did a lot of things, a lot of mischief together, but also, even today, these two elements are entangled in ways that we can't quite pull apart. And the final house is the House of Dreams. It's the movie that Michael sold. It's Hollywood, but as one of Michael's law professors said to me, and for him, he's a very eminent constitutional law professor, he said, don't blame Hollywood, because I talked about how strange it was that Michael was going to see almost a fantasy version of himself writ large, and he would love to go around and say to his professors, who's going to play you? I think Danny DeVito should be you, Guido. But he said, don't blame Hollywood, because Hollywood's in the business of writing stories with happy endings, and everyone was invested in the happy ending. He said, Yale Law School gave the story to the New York Times. The New York Times gave the story to Hollywood, and probably his friends helped give the story to the Times, by which he also meant me. And in a sense, that's true, because I knew nothing about severe mental illness, and I was also entirely enmeshed in this world of ignorance and accident and good intentions.
So wonderful, Jonathan. Thank you for the overview. And you know, you construct the book in the four houses, but actually they're all intertwined, and they're all intertwined throughout the book. So I think of it also as a sociological study. It was sort of like the sociology of growing up Jewish in New Rochelle, which was really fascinating. With your mother, your parents being writers and academics, and Cynthia Ozick, and the similarities, and then the psychiatry piece. Also, like in the zeitgeist, like, so you talk about it both in terms of popular culture, you talk about it when you're at Berkeley, and sort of academically, how it shows up over time, and as you said, the interconnectedness of law and psychiatry, and they all, like I said, you set them up in four houses, but to me it's really it was the weaving the fabric of the narrative of the whole narrative, which you do so beautifully.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad you said that, because I always try to point out that, yeah, the houses are not hermetically sealed. On the contrary, the House of Psychiatry was literally built by Cecil B. DeMille when the movie industry was centered in Westchester. It was already a house of dreams. And psychiatry, especially psychoanalysis, derived medical theories from dreams. And so the world of stories and the world of fantasy were deeply intertwined. The one thing I would ask, I hope not ask, but I would love to do, simply because one of the problems that the world in this book has is that it's a tendency to make theories out of everything. And there were a lot of theories about madness and psychiatry that were in themselves disastrous. And so I would just like to read the little italic introduction, because in a sense, it was how I realized I could write the book, since it was working its way backwards just to being inside of my own childhood. It's just a few paragraphs. And I'll also read the epigraph. Every chapter has an epigraph. I love epigraphs, partly because it's all these other voices. Some of them are popular songs, but some of them are from literature. And as I said, Michael had a photographic memory. I was dyslexic, so a little epigraph went a long way for me. I could recite poems, but it was easier to do that than the whole book. And so it was wonderful to enlist all of these pieces, both of my own childhood and of the culture, in the writing of this. So the opening epigraph is a stanza from a poem by Yeats. I call to the mysterious one who yet shall walk the wet sands by the edge of the stream and look most like me, being indeed my double, and prove of all imaginable things the most unlike, being my anti-self. William Butler Yeats, Ego Dominus Tuus. And then the house on Maryland Road, and since you mentioned houses, I'll read this last little epigraph, Wallace Stevens. It is an illusion that we were ever alive, lived in the houses of mothers, arranged ourselves by our own motions in a freedom of air. Wallace Stevens, The Rock. I am going back 50 years, before the lurid headlines, the Hollywood deal, the publishing contract, and the New York Times profile of the role model genius who finished Yale Law School against all odds. Before delusions mistaken for stories and stories mistaken for life. Before the fancy clothes you bought for management consulting and wore into the hospital, the halfway house, and the Gatsby house you guarded with a baseball bat against enemies disguised as friends and family, guarded in turn by beloved neighbors. I am going back to the time before you graduated from Yale summa cum laude, which I always thought of as summa cum laude, since you achieved in 3 years what I failed to accomplish in 4. Before high school, where you ran while I was beaten, and the horror 20 years later when it was my turn to run. I am on a road racing backward out of a tragic sorrow whose circles radiate in all directions. Forgive me. I know there is no road, and it isn't racing backward or forward. I know there is no going back. But here I am on a short street in New Rochelle. There is a green and white colonial house at the top of the hill and a brown and white Tudor house at the bottom. There are 2 10-year-old boys who live in those houses, even now. They're just illusions, but they're also real, and they're where I've got to start.
Thank you, Jonathan, for doing that. So I think that you'll all get a sense of it. Not only is the story told in such a beautiful narrative way, but Jonathan, your language is just exquisite. And I would like, I started underlining. I underlined so many sentences here because it's just beautiful. So even just what I'm going to just quote one here. When you talk about stories, you say stories were like molecules in the house I grew up in, the building blocks of life, because you grew up in such a literary home. So let's start a little bit with the relationship between you and Michael. You actually, your lives were remarkably intertwined. You didn't just grow up down the street from each other, but you, as you said, you went to the same summer camp, the same, university, and there was competitiveness with the two of you too. So why don't you talk a little bit about your relationship, both in the beginning and then over time?
Yeah, the relationship changed. It was always initially just I would call for him every morning on the way to elementary school, which was right behind his house. He was very precocious. We were both very tall, but he seemed very tall, and he walked on the tips of his toes. And there was a way in which he really I thought of him as like living backwards, as if he'd already been an adult, and he was just slumming it in childhood. He knew adult things. He also had 2 older brothers, and I had a sister. And though our fathers were both college professors, his father had grown up in Brooklyn and wore a leather bomber jacket, taught economics. My father had fled Vienna on a kinder transport, taught German literature, wore tweed jackets, and sometimes we'd see our fathers talking, and Michael's father had a booming voice and would be marching towards my father, who would be kind of waltzing backwards. And that was their different styles. So when I went to Michael's house, where he had these brothers, it was just like a Darwinian scrimmage. If you didn't eat really fast at the meal, the food would be gone. My family, when I played Monopoly with my sister, she would let you finish making the Monopoly, or I'd let her keep that because I knew she liked yellow, so she could have all of those. It was the opposite of his house, and he loved to come over to my house. I think there was a way in which it was a refuge for him. I was fascinated, though, by his house because it was everything that we weren't. And over time, he changed, I changed, but we were still close, still competitive. We had some experiences together I tell a story about. Basically, I always saw myself as the tortoise to his hare. His bar mitzvah, he had a photographic memory. Mine was the worst day of my life. For reasons that you can read about if you choose. Sometimes people who've read my book just sit down next to me and say, the bar mitzvah, in this consoling voice. We were both beaten up in high school, except only I was beaten up. It was like a gang of kids because he got away, and it seemed like an aspect of his street smarts. We never talked about it, but in a way it weighed on both of us for different reasons. I felt like it was a humiliating failure that I had been so distracted that I thought, wow, these kids are really going to beat me up, and they did. Whereas Michael, who prided himself on smarts and played basketball much more aggressively, shook loose, but was standing there when I finally got up. But there was, as I mentioned in the introduction, a sense that eventually it was my turn to run. So, and right before we went to college, although people identified us with each other, many people I hadn't seen for many years, who I then talked to in the writing of the book, would say to me, "You were like brothers. It would be unthinkable to have one without the other." But right before we went to college, and we both went to Yale, he said, "I don't think I'll see much of you." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, you're too slow." And so he also thought I was the tortoise, and he was the hare. And I think that that's probably why, when he became sick, to my great shame in retrospect, I was still thinking, no, he's just napping, or that in my mind the race was still on, and that was not the case. I lived inside the story I'd imagined around us in some way, and we both enjoyed being competitive with each other, but it was complicated, and we were both obsessed without even having to say so, but this becomes a large element of the book, with being smart. It was easier for him to be smart than me because I was always concealing things I couldn't do, but his mind was all overtness. We never knew why it was important to be smart. It just was. You were never going to do anything useful with your intelligence. It was just a thing you were going to discover, like a birthmark that meant you were really Prince,
Right. And you talk a lot about, actually, when you're younger, that the rivalry, that you became school editor, like the two of you were both up for that special summer program that, you were very proud of getting it, and then you found out he got it. Also, you became the editor of the newspaper, and he decided he didn't want to write with the newspaper. So that
yes, he quit the paper when I became editor-in-chief. But I would not have quit if he had been editor. And we were both going to be editors together.
And it's interesting because you also weave through, and you talk about how you, he fled from you maybe when you went to Yale, but how when you say here you fled later, but
no, he fled from me when I was getting beaten up.
Well, yeah, it was also when you were getting beaten up, yeah, no,
Right.
for sure. But how later you, once he was sick, was what how you felt, and you use the example of Cain and Abel, which is an example that also he wanted to study with you in the hospital. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, and and the two of you as using that as a bit of analogy in terms of kind of brothers?
When I visited him, my parents called to tell, I was in graduate school, and my parents called to tell me that Michael had had a psychotic break. I didn't know what that meant, but I went to see him. I was in graduate school, and I will say parenthetically that in graduate school in English literature, for some reason, it was necessary to read Foucault's Madness and Civilization. Everybody had to. Foucault was the paradigm, the lens through which you looked at many things. And one of Foucault's concepts is that madness is an invention of the Enlightenment as a way of demonizing the other, so you can lock them up in psychiatric hospitals, which were also an invention of the Enlightenment, as a way of punishing difference. So that madness was really just a social construct. It took me about 3 seconds visiting Michael in a locked ward to realize that he was not suffering from a social construct. So right away, the weirdness of understanding that theories on which many things were based were simply melted into air in the presence of someone's embodied disorder. But I visited him, and then he asked me to come back and thought we could study together. He had become mysteriously religious. His father had told me not to talk to him about religion because he thought it was a symptom, as in some ways it was. Although, as I say, it's a joke Michael would have appreciated, that a symptom of madness is becoming an Orthodox Jew. But he was wearing a kippah, and he wanted to study. So I came and brought what he had asked me to bring. That alone was an adventure because he told me I had to hide the book about the Bible and tell Michal I wasn't yet married to my wife, but she said, "I don't think you have to wrap that book in brown paper. They'll let you in." And I realized that I was already inhabiting a delusion of his. And whether it was my natural deferring to his authority, because he usually knew what was going on, about the Watergate hearings or whatever it was he was telling me about, or if there was something in me that just lent itself right away to someone else's conviction about danger. But in any case, we were going to study the Bible, and I thought we'd start at the beginning and read Genesis, but he wanted, read in the very beginning, but he wanted to read Cain and Abel. And I knew somehow he was going to ask to do that. And so we read it, and he asked the question I knew he was going to ask, which was, why is Cain's sacrifice not accepted? And for which there really is no good answer given in the Bible either. But it was the first time, I think, I realized that he felt, this person who had done everything so easily, that there had been some profound rejection of him or his abilities. And I really did flee that locked door. But I also realized in myself that I'm the one who felt that I needed to answer Cain's question. I'd never felt more like Cain. Why? That there was an obligation that I was not fulfilling. And that's part of what it meant, I think, for me to encounter somebody who, first of all, had just been a deep friend, but our friendship had fallen away in many ways, who was a touchstone of high mental functioning, and who was in an abject state, in an abject place. And in a locked ward, and the locked nature of the thing was so mysterious and frightening to me. And he spoke of it as a prison, and he still believed they were going to give him, that Mengele was going to give him a lobotomy without anesthesia. So even though he was actually, again, because everything turns out to be the odd inverse of what you imagine, he was very lucky to be in that place for 8 months, because it gave his doctors a chance to find the combination of medications he needed to at least stabilize him enough to leave. 8 months is a luxury in today's system, and it was even then a lucky thing, although it didn't seem that way to me at the time.
So let's stay on the topic of psychiatry, because you did an enormous amount of research. And you talk about, you do want to sort of summarize the 40 years of psychiatry that you summarize in the book in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But sort of, because you do go through sort of the arc of what happened in psychiatry, both in terms of, you do it both in terms of the practice of psychiatry and the institutionalization and the deinstitutionalization and what happened, but also through the lens of literature, like Foucault and others, and Allen Ginsberg when you're at Berkeley, and even in the popular culture, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was popular then, you know, and the movies, like, so. Can you sort of weave that story a little bit?
Sure. Well, one of the things that really amazed me was discovering how seductive other people's severe mental illness was to people who like to think about what it means to be human. People kept borrowing madness. I was almost like the asylum was like a central bank. You know, you could take it and use it for your own purposes. So Freud did not treat people with severe mental illness, but he derived principles from people with severe mental illness, as he did from dreams. And when he wrote about the psychopathology of everyday life, he was defining everyday life as a pathology that required the treatment and care of a psychoanalyst. And so instead of psychiatrists, who used to be called alienists, living in state hospitals out in the countryside where they were, caring for patients for whom there was no treatment, or suffering from diseases for which there was no treatment, suddenly a psychiatrist, if you were a psychoanalyst, could open an office and see people the way a dentist did, because you were treating people formerly known as well, who now suffered from the psychopathology of everyday life. And so the redefinition of mental illness was an aspect of what was happening. And that meant also that the brain model of psychiatry was forgotten in a sense. And that had enormous effect on how people treated the disorder. Because when it came to deinstitutionalization, to opening up those psychiatric hospitals and replacing them, they were not replaced with intensely focused centers to care in the community for those who were most in need. They were replaced with something called community mental health centers. And first, mental illness became a metaphor for mental illness, for wellness, and then health became a metaphor for illness. And if everyone is ill, no one is, in a sense. And so you had Foucault borrowing madness and bestowing it, either making it an imaginary condition or elevating it. And one thing I would also like to point out is that in the 50s, in the same year, actually, in like 1954, the first antipsychotic medication was patented. And that's the same year that LSD was introduced. And they were both given to psychiatrists to do something with. And so psychiatrists had a drug in one hand that induced hallucinations, and they had a drug in the other hand that suppressed them. And the culture voted and decided that the one that induced hallucinations was mind expanding and a form of higher knowledge. And people who naturally lived in those states must be priests or prophets. And so who would want to take the drug that suppressed these things when suddenly taking a drug that induced them was elevated to a kind of artistic, mystical level? And you mentioned One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Kesey wrote that novel. It had nothing to do with mental disorder. He was part of the government drug testing program, MK Ultra. He was a veteran, so he was given a variety of drugs, and he really liked LSD. So he got a job working at the VA where he got them at night. And so he'd be there tripping, working, wandering around the halls of the psychiatric unit, and everyone looked just like him as far as he was concerned. And when he wrote his book, it was really about the oppressive nature of the state. And so when the movie was then made, which Michael and I saw when we were young, it takes a while to realize that the hero of that movie, who's in a psychiatric hospital, does not have mental illness. That's his defining feature. He's there almost by accident, like a Kafka character. He woke up one day and he was in this place. And Michael used to say about himself, I'm the McMurphy character, which it took me a while to realize meant he didn't actually see himself. He saw himself as a victim of circumstance, not of severe mental illness. And everybody made that confusion. And when the guy who made the movie, Milos Forman, had escaped from Czechoslovakia, he saw it, as he said, Nurse Ratched was the Communist Party. So for him, he also had his metaphor. And the one group of people who most needed to be seen and recognized and understood as having a severe illness that was not caused the way psychoanalytically treated disorders were caused, which is to say in childhood by repression. And psychiatrists very cruelly would tell mothers they were responsible for the child's schizophrenia. It was caused by something that we still don't understand, but that we understand is anchored in the brain. And so there were so many things were happening. They weren't meant to all be happening. And add to that the fact that, we'd won the Second World War, and when Kennedy said we were going to go to the moon, we really did. So when he said, even though he didn't live to see it, but he's the one who said, because his own sister had been in a psychiatric hospital and received a secret lobotomy from Joe Kennedy, he said we're going to replace the cold custodial care of the asylum with the warm embrace of the community. A hard thing to legislate. I mean, the thing is, it's easier to go to the moon than cure what was still called lunacy until the Obama administration. And so people who wanted to change the system used that optimism and the promise of medication that they didn't really understand and that didn't work as they imagined in order to transform a system that was then just bureaucratically ingrained. So that's I did it in more than 2 minutes. And it's not even a history, sad to say. It's more of a salad. I'm sorry.
And then actually the law enters into it, because then the question is, whether people can be forcibly, the question of people's rights and, the conflict between psychiatry and rights and the laws. Do you want to talk about that for just a...
Well, people who made the legal determination did not understand the nature of the illness. And so one of the epigraphs is a lawyer saying, it's up to lawyers to decide who should be hospitalized. And eventually what happened is that being ill was not a reason to go to the hospital if you had severe mental illness. Only being violent, and not just being violent, but being an imminent danger to yourself or others. And so they redefined a severe illness, which doesn't have as a symptom violence, but they made violence the legal requirement for hospitalization. And there was an entire mental health bar, which was an aspect of civil liberty, seen as a civil liberties movement, which was devoted to keeping people out of psychiatric hospitals, although people told themselves they were keeping people out of institutions. If you were severely ill, often what happened is you wound up in prison. So you wound up in another institution, just a different one. And there has never been a good legal reckoning. But two of Michael's professors had clerked for a judge who had changed the laws, and one of the things he had done in the 50s, which he saw as a civil rights transformation of the law, was lower the bar for being not guilty by reason of insanity. So if you were arrested for housebreaking, that was the test case, they could call in a psychiatrist who might say that you were not in your right mind, but what this judge imagined was that you would then go to a hospital for 6 months. A psychoanalyst would cure you based on what evidence no one can imagine, and then you'd be released again. Instead, what happened is that people disappeared for years into these state hospitals, but also the notion that you would take that as a way of accommodating people, especially he felt it was harder for blacks to benefit, as he saw it, from the insanity defense. So he thought, well, let's just bring the insanity defense to all kinds of crimes. He was then labeling people insane who were not. B, he was raising and lowering the bar of madness like an interest rate almost, just to influence the incarceration rates. And he was ultimately making prisons and hospitals weirdly synonymous and emptying out the meaning of both of them. And it was all very well intentioned. He was then horrified and undid what he had done. But the amount of experimentation that was done on almost no evidence at all, it was really painful to encounter because lives were undone.
So you just used the words good intentions. Can we deconstruct the title? So The Best Minds, a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions. Do you want to deconstruct each of those pieces?
Well, it wasn't called The Best Minds until after I'd finished writing it. I was going to call it No Going Back. And I guess I meant by that no going back to the time of state hospitals, no going back to an older era, no going back to childhood. And when I visited Michael after he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, it took me many years to visit him. And I visited him in the forensic hospital where he was. I told him I'd watched the Western Shane with my daughters. And he said, oh, the book's better, which is what he always said, because he had always read the book as well. But then he told me a piece of the book, and the piece of the book he told me was when Shane, who is a gunslinger who hangs up his gun so he can help a family that's homesteading, but when they're being harassed and really threatened by killers, he takes his guns down and he kills the bad guys, and he rides away. As Michael said, he wears a black hat even though he's the hero. And the little boy runs after him and asks him to come back, and Shane says, there's no going back from a killing. And even though Michael never acknowledged killing someone, when I would visit him, he seemed to embody an awareness of it, and it was one of those mysterious encounters. So for all those reasons, it was going to be called No Going Back. And I like the paradox because the first line of the book that I read you is, I am going back. Because although you say you're not going back, what else can you do but attempt to go back and reimagine? But I changed it because the editor was like, I think you can do better. I'll be honest. And I decided to call it The Best Minds, which is a line from Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, another mysterious use of severe mental illness in a way. I've seen the best minds of my generation starving, naked, hysterical. Allen Ginsberg's mother was schizophrenic. He literally signed the permission for her to have a lobotomy, never forgave himself, but kind of devoted his whole poetic career to rearranging the world so that madness would be the normal state in a way, in a very complex way. But what I liked about The Best Minds was the reverberation of both that poem, but also the idea of experts making decisions. You know, the best and the brightest had figured out the Vietnam War, and then they figured out the war on poverty on the back of the same envelope. And the idea that the theory was going to solve it, and that Michael and I ourselves had this idea of what it meant to be one of the best minds. And the meritocracy was in full bloom in a way, and Michael's professors had even been a little ahead of their time, so that for them, getting into the places like Yale was really, you had to be you had to beat out everyone else from your neighborhood. And there was a kind of ruthless application of brains. And they saw in Michael, even when they knew he couldn't do the work, someone who had about him that brilliance. They spoke of him as a genius. But what that really meant was that and I guess I wondered a lot about this myself, the worship of intelligence is part of a redefined mind. The mind was really redefined in the eugenic period in the early 20th century, where it was the measurable mind that mattered. If your mind fell below a certain IQ level, the Supreme Court said you could be sterilized. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. It was no longer the soul. It was psyche used to mean the soul. And then the mind that could only be measured became the unit of worth. And I think there was a reason Michael and I were so afraid of not having it. And when his choice was between working at a slow, quiet job at first, at Macy's or in a supermarket, or going to Yale Law School, there was no question, because one meant salvation, and we all agreed with that notion, even though I think it wasn't cruel advice, it was understandable advice that he needed to have a slow, quiet, long, protracted recovery. And even if he didn't have it, why did we all feel it was being cast into outer darkness to do something in which your mind was not all in all? And so in that sense, it's a questioning of a world I grew up in a way that I don't have an answer, but none of the book, I'm framing questions, let's put it that way. So, and the tragedy of good intentions, people who thought they were helping him, and the very way in which they were helping him, in a sense, by erasing the severity of his illness. Instead of accommodating his illness, they thought they could accommodate him. And the Times article left out elements. And so, in a sense, all those good intentions were really not honoring his autonomy, as people felt they were at the end when he had stopped taking his medication and he was hallucinating and delusional, but facilitating his illness.
I'm going to make sure we have time for questions. Don't worry. I have so many questions. I'm trying to decide which one to ask next.
I'm just going to answer with 5 words or less from now on.
No.
This is the speed round.
It's so good. So Jonathan, you're very self-revelatory in this, right? And so you talk not just about your relationship with Michael, but also your own, anxieties and insecurities. And why did you decide to include your narrative in such detail in the book, in a story about Michael?
I think it probably has to do with the decision to go back and tell and write about everyone as if we were all characters, even though we were all real. And it seemed, and I guess, it's not that it seemed only fair. I don't like disclosing things about myself. I know you wouldn't think that if you read the book. But adolescence itself is a time where you can wonder if you're normal or what normal is. And I wanted to capture that time, which lasts a long time, where you don't know what you're supposed to be, what's normal and what isn't. And what does it mean that the culture itself is not urging you to take drugs, but making we had teachers who wore T-shirts that said sex, drugs, and rock and roll on it. And by the way, drugs, if you have a predisposition to a severe psychotic disorder, are a devastation. They're a disaster. But I have met a remarkable number of kids whose dark secret, like mine, was that we really didn't do drugs. That you weren't participating in this thing that was your new heritage. And so I guess I just thought, especially because once I discovered how anxious I was, and even took an SSRI in its early days, suddenly I was someone with a mental illness and a medication. And I didn't want someone telling me that I had to take it, or that I couldn't take it, or that I had to stop taking it. And so I thought of Michael, in a sense, as an extension of myself, and that was a disservice to him. The DSM, the psychiatric desk reference, that is what allows you to call something a mental illness, has arachnophobia in it, as well as schizophrenia, or fear of the number 13. And because insurance will cover it. But when you read an article and journalists are constantly saying half of all Americans will be diagnosed with a mental illness this year, well, 1% of the population has schizophrenia, 2 or 3% have bipolar disorder. There are medications for both of those disorders. They have no, and they're quite effective. But the idea that all of these things would be considered as one giant fungible mass, I think is a disaster. And I wanted to write about my own sense of myself. First, the terror of thinking, good God, I'm not right, you know? And then discovering shamefully and regretfully, no, I am normal. And this is what it means to be human. And it contributed, I think, to some degree. It allowed me to go on thinking, you know, I was a tortoise and Michael was a hare, even if I was like a tortoise in a taxi going faster than I thought I would. And so I suppose that's why. And because also, I guess, everything has larger meaning, but it also lives inside of its own unfolding, and my unfolding was who I was. That was the person that experienced all that happened. It changed as I went, but there's no general, and taking the mental illness to scale as a public health project was part of the disaster of closing hospitals and opening something as if it were all a matter of giving people vaccines. That was more than 5 words.
No, it's
But it
it's so good.
it involved
I'm gonna
self-revelation.
I'm going
so
to
I had
ask
to
one
talk
more
about it.
question. I'm going to open it up, and then I'll ask a final question. So let's talk about Carrie. So Carrie is the woman, his fiancée, who he killed. He thought he stopped, as Jonathan said, he went off his medicine, and he thought she was a robot that was trying to kill him. And so he killed her, and as it turns out, no one knew she was pregnant as well. And, you know, so there's a lot of focus on Michael because obviously he was your childhood friend, but I think we should lift up Carrie and talk. Why don't you talk a little bit about, you didn't know her, and just, you know, like bring her into the room and honor her memory by talking about her and what the world lost when Michael killed her.
Yeah, one of the epigraphs is a line from a story in the Washington Post about the victim. Less was immediately known, because Michael was famous in a way, and you could talk about all these elements in his life. Brad Pitt, Hollywood. It was very important to me, I realized at a certain point, to make her present, and I was very moved by the people I met, her colleagues and friends, who were very eager to talk to me about her. And the mystery and strangeness of saying, I grew up on the street with, you know, I was best friends with the boy who grew up and killed her. But they, for them, had carried this story around, and making her present, again, not only as this victim, known or unknown, but as this vibrant person who, as one of her colleagues said, knew what she was getting into. She loved him. And so that was just, became very important to me. And it also, early on when I realized that I was doing this, was a recognition to myself that I wasn't finishing Michael's story or telling it. I was telling my own story in that way, and it was just very important to make her vibrantly there, which was easy to do because the people who knew Michael always said she's very shy and always in the shadows, and the people who knew her saw Michael as this mysterious figure in the shadows who was an example of her largeness of spirit because they knew he was ill.
Right, and as you say, she loved him, you know, and she knew about his mental illness, and she loved him. Julie, let's open it up for a couple of questions. Anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I can. Yeah, Janet. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. I'm curious, since you did know him so intimately when he was young, you mentioned several things about his behavior that, to me as a mental health clinician, I would have been suspicious of. Walking on his tiptoes, several other things you mentioned. Were you aware of those kinds of differences in him going back then?
That's a very good question. People ask all the time. No, I was not aware. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I admired, back then I was not aware. In fact, some of the things that were reasons why people didn't like him, actually, his brashness, his arrogance, his overweening self-confidence, really borderline grandiosity, of which I was a victim. I mean, he couldn't work for me. That's another reason why I felt obliged to describe who I was, in a sense. I'm named for someone who was murdered in the Holocaust, so for me, just taking up space was a navigation in a way, and so he took up space and more. And so I think I was too busy marveling at it to wonder, again, what it might mean. What was interesting for me to realize or learn is that his grandmother had schizophrenia. His father was intimately acquainted. And you might have thought that would mean that, of course, it would be recognized right away. But in many cases, I've also come to realize that that's exactly why you would say, my son is going to Yale Law School, and not, in fact, thinking about it. So, I mean, right, exactly, and there you go.
And actually, you talk about in the book how, like even when looking back, so when he was at Bain and he was convinced that he was being bugged, right? And you talk about his parents, like you guys trying to debug, not even thinking that it was paranoia, but that you believed he was such a strong presence that he could convince people of things, and
we were always being warned about cults. So the fact that people were following him home, I think his parents thought, I was always looking over my shoulder for those mythical Moonies who were going to put something in my microbiotic food. And maybe they would, that's the thing. It's a paranoid age. What was amazing to me also, again, is that he saw Nazis in the streets of New Rochelle. Well, my house, that was just another day at the office. It seemed like a perfectly normal thing, but for him, it was not, obviously. It's not like I said, oh, yes, of course, I see them all the time. But I guess what I mean is it's hard to know when you just have the presumption of sanity that you extend. He read when in fifth grade, he had piles of books on his desk, and he read them randomly, one into the other. His fifth grade teacher said to me, if I'd known anything, I would have known that was a sign of something. In fact, and she said, who reads Lord of the Flies in fifth grade? I mean, I'm sure people do. He did and recited it, but.
Jonathan, in the book, you get into the evolution of how, through many different generations, of how we deal with mental illness in our society and the political issues that come up. And I was left with many more questions than answers. And I wondered if you can shed any light on where you come out on how we should deal with what is today a real mental illness problem with homelessness, too.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and I do now think about it all the time. And I do think there are policies that really matter, although the problem is that so many systems are broken. Some things only the city can do, some things only the state can do. The federal government has to change Medicaid because it doesn't reimburse for people who are in long-term care facilities. For me, the biggest, if I had to give a one-sentence takeaway, it would be don't lie if you can avoid it. Don't pretend that something is other than it seems, even if you will learn more later the details of it. In other words, the number of people willing to treat him as if he were simply expressing his will when he quite clearly had been robbed of his autonomy was a devastating disservice. That's one thing I'd say. Something else I would say, and again, it comes from knowing more than the history that you're presented with by people who want to change things, is that the people spoke of the state hospitals, which had fallen in terrible times as snake pits and, as if they were just the haunted houses they came to look like once they'd become ruins. But it's important to remember that in the early 19th century, when they didn't exist, the real snake pits were basements where people were chained or beaten, and that a diagnosis can be stigmatizing, but if the alternative is demonic possession or believing someone has a character flaw, which is why they're acting as they do, then you're really doing something dreadful. And Dorothea Dix, who was one of the early great reformers, whose father was often homeless and probably mentally ill, and certainly an alcoholic, went to every governor in the country in the early 1800s and persuaded them that a civilization worthy of the name ought to have places that gave people asylum and not leave them to die on the street. And so those hospitals that were originally built to provide what was called moral care, they were light and airy, they were in rustic settings because it was believed that was more healthy, there were gardens, they were landscaped. Those were done out of an appropriate desire to create shelter for people. And the idea of asylum, even if we don't build asylums, is still necessary. And so I think it was too easy. There's a fantastic book of photographs of ruined psychiatric hospitals, and the introduction is by Oliver Sacks. And he talks about all the bad things that they had fallen into, and then he says his brother, who had schizophrenia, spent much time in various psychiatric hospitals and found real respite there from the storms of life. And so in the fear of to turn something into the Bastille so you can knock it down rather than reform it, to my mind, is not a good thing to do. And so that's not answering your question. I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards. There are obvious programs, and people need to be able to stay in the hospital as long as they need to stay in the hospital. There has to be a way for those who do not know they are ill, which is a cruel symptom in many cases for people with severe psychiatric disorders, that they suffer from something called anosognosia. I mean, it makes sense. The mind that you use to understand the world is the afflicted organ, so you're convinced you're well. And that means that someone may need to help you get help even if you are sure you don't need it. And that's both a legal matter and a moral matter in a way. So anyway, all these things need to come into play. And the number of people who were horrified when the mayor had a small expansion of interpreting the rule that would allow you to bring someone to the hospital, just bring them to the hospital for evaluation. The Times had headlines, mentally ill, homeless people to be rounded up even if they're not violent, as if violence were the required symptom, and so I guess all I'm saying is, the biggest thing for me is just to talk openly about it. Maybe that's also why I revealed myself in some way.
So which is great, because the last question I'm going to ask you is, and then Jonathan's going to stay around. We have books for sale. He's happy to sign books and answer your questions on an individual basis. I just volunteered your time.
I owe them, because I keep every question becomes a meal.
Why did you decide to write this book? What were your hopes and dreams, and have they been fulfilled in the way that you were thinking about it in the beginning, or in the middle, or towards the end?
I wrote the book out of a kind of compulsion, and I didn't know what it was that I was writing. And by the time I did, it was too late to stop, and it became a book about many things. I had put my arms around a lot of things. I was trying to understand the world I'd grown up in, which played a great role. My ambition for quite a while, you probably remember this when you had lunch at our house, was just not to die on the mountain. I wanted to not just finish it, but I wanted to be able to bring together the pieces that I wanted to bring together and yet still have it remain inside of a house, even if it was a house with broken windows and an open door. So I think, and as for the experience of having published it, enormously moving for me, because I read the epigraphs. Last thing I'll say is the epigraph that is at the beginning of the book is this Yeats poem. But something Yeats wrote that I like even more is something he said in one of his notebooks, I think, where he wrote that art is not the chief end of life, but an accident that happens in the course of your search for reality. And I really think about writing much more now like that. And it's a very collaborative thing. It feels this book is my search for reality. And even the people I talk to afterwards, I feel like they're still contributing to it in a way. So I feel enormously lucky, is the truth.
And we're enormously lucky that you wrote it, because it's really a spectacular work. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thanks very much.